I think it's terrible when we can't know the results of an election the night of the election in a modern day age of computer. I think it's a terrible thing. And I happen to think it was a terrible decision for our country made by the Supreme Court.
Back the president's reaction to the Pennsylvania case that we discussed with Senator Casey just before the break. The High Court ruled to allow extended vote counting in Pennsylvania for up to 3 days. Also, North Carolina as well. But it rejected it when it came to Wisconsin. The days following Election Day could be filled with litigation, so the courts all the way up to the High Court could be quite busy, as they say, in the coming days. Let's bring in our next guest, Dahlia Lithwick. She is senior editor at Slate magazine. She's also the Supreme Court reporter, and we always go to Dahlia when we're trying to get a read on where the court may go and the significance. And obviously, Dahlia, we're dealing with a remade court, and it's not just put on the tinfoil hat. The president has openly said he wants this election to be litigated by the Supreme Court. So first off, what would be the threshold that they would have to take it up? How contested would it be? And I assume it would center around the mail-in voting.
I mean, one of the things that I think is hard to square is that there are going to be dozens of lawsuits filed. We've already seen a couple. Today, there was one filed, a big one in Pennsylvania, another one in Nevada that's now going up to the Nevada Supreme Court. It's useful to remember, to the extent that it helps at all, that at the time Bush v. Gore, that Florida case was filed, there were 20 other similar lawsuits around the country. So the threshold is kind of, there's going to be a bunch of lawsuits. There is this question about what is the quote unquote margin of litigation, which is at what point does it not make any sense because this lawsuit wouldn't change things? And that's one factor. And then another factor is, as you've said, the Supreme Court has been weighing in for the last 2 weeks on lawsuits out of Alabama, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina. So already we've seen the court wading into some of these early questions. But I think the bigger question is going to be, if there's some sort of blowout, or in a state where there's a blowout, it no longer makes sense for the courts to be dealing with this. So I think the thing to watch for in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Nevada and North Carolina is really, is it close enough? Is the margin significantly tiny that it makes sense to go forth with the litigation? At that point, there is this larger question of whether the Supreme Court wants to take the case. It's useful to remember they can bat anything away as they see fit. You know,
for me, though, Dahlia, what I take offense to is, and I've heard the argument from, both electeds and well, if Biden wins going away, it'll be okay. But the idea that somebody watching me at home in the middle of a pandemic decided to take the option that was afforded to them to do a mail-in ballot, follow the rules, get it actually postmarked in time, and because the post office, and if you want to go down the thread here with me, that the Postmaster General cut funding to the post office, you had a federal judge today that's now ordering people to go through some of the post office service areas that coincidentally are in very blue areas to make sure what's going on with the ballots, for their vote not to count because it wasn't delivered in time, even though they did everything right, is ridiculous to me, especially since we don't have to have this decided in the next 48 hours.
Yeah, a couple of things. One thing is, it's important to remember, and we can just talk about military ballots, that the military has been mailing in their ballots. They have been counted after Election Day since the Civil War. This is not new. So the idea that we need a decision by November 3rd because the president wants a decision by November 3rd flies in the face of a long, long, long historical record that we count all the votes, and different states have different deadlines and different mechanisms. But you're quite right. The idea that this is done the night of November 3rd because Donald Trump says so, that's just ridiculous, and it's fanciful, and by the way, not rooted in any doctrine. I think you're also right to flag that this year is really different from other elections, not just because the Postal Service in some jurisdictions has slowed to a crawl, in some cases by design, as you say. That was the Postmaster General setting the apple cart in August and September. But we also have a pandemic, and we know what happened, say, in Wisconsin, when people in the primary were trying to vote during a pandemic, and the Supreme Court said, we're not going to do anything to make it easier to vote. So those two factors, in conjunction with the fact that the president has now announced that the Supreme Court is going to decide the election for him, makes it all feel really hinky. And you're quite right that nobody wants to see that settled after the fact in a court. To the extent that I can offer any solace, I would say it seems that all of these different factors and attempts to suppress the vote may have had a kind of ricochet effect, because I think an awful lot of people who weren't that invested in this election on policy grounds really did not like hearing that ballots were going to be thrown away. And a lot of those people, I think, showed up today, surprising nobody as much as the pundits like me.
You know, but again, it's a shame that the people had to lose an option, if you will, afforded to them again in a pandemic, to put themselves in harm's way because they didn't want to risk losing, their ability to participate in a democratic, free and fair election. But that said, I've heard a lot of folks who said, colleagues of yours who say, you know what, Rich, at the end of the day, regardless of whether 6 are conservative and 3 are progressive, for a justice to look at the facts in front of him without any evidence of fraud and decide to negate the free will of the American public in an election is a reach that even they don't believe, however the court is constituted, that they go along with. And even if we look at the lower courts in Texas, for example, in Harris County, 127,000 votes that were filed properly in drop-in boxes. All of a sudden, there was a challenge to that, and an all Republican-appointed court said, no, stop it, and literally laughed at the suggestion of it. I know it's being appealed, but should we have faith in the court system that at the end of the day, regardless of whoever appointed them, unless there's massive fraud and evidence of it, they're going to uphold, the right of the electorate?
Nobody is more concerned than I am at some of the rhetoric that we heard last week coming even out of the Supreme Court, where we had Brett Kavanaugh, for instance, talking about ballots that come in after November 3rd as quote unquote flipping the results, as though, you can say that something that happens in the 6th inning of a ball game flips the results. Like, it's rhetoric that has no roots, as I said, in law or in doctrine. It's just a presidential talking point about we want this to be decided early. Sam Alito talked similarly in one of his dissents in that Pennsylvania case you discussed about how the election can't progress under a cloud, that there's this doubt that is suddenly seated if the election isn't called on election night. That stuff is scary for all the reasons you say. That is just, it seems to be a pretext that doesn't have any basis in law for starting to throw out votes. I take great, great confidence in the fact that a very, very pro-Trump judge in Harris County refused to entertain that Texas suit. I take great confidence in the fact that the Fifth Circuit, the most conservative federal appellate court, also refused to entertain it. It suggests to me that the judiciary is doing a thing now that it might not have done 2 weeks ago, when it was very emboldened to sort of wade into this. I think that they're now standing back and saying, we can't be the but-for cause of an election night upheaval where people start really doubting, as you say, that their vote is going to be counted, not for any legal reason, but for completely pretextual political reasons. And so I've seen in the last few days the courts pulling back. A Nevada court just kicked away another similar effort to get a bunch of ballots invalidated. So I think what you're going to see now, I hope, is the court saying, look, we will, absolutely decide constitutional disputes on the merits. But these purely pretextual, partisan, ideological fights that have nothing to do with anything other than suppressing the vote, that we're not going to do. And I think whether the Supreme Court decides to take that leap or not, as you say, we've got Justice Amy Coney Barrett now sitting on the court. She was not sitting on any of those decisions that happened in the last 2 weeks. But I think you might see the court really doing a gut check and saying our own legitimacy is on the line now. we're not going to start citing Bush v. Gore, a case that was never meant, by the way, to be cited as precedent and yet keeps popping up in these lawsuits. I think the court is going to be a little bit careful in ways that I didn't necessarily anticipate a week ago.
All right. Well, hopefully you're right. And obviously, Dahlia, a week from today, the ACA is before the court. There's an important LGBTQ case as well before it. And Biden said if elected, he's going to have a commission that's going to come back in 6 months about how to maybe even remake the Supreme Court or reconsider it. So much to get to, and we'll get into that in future conversation. But thank you. And I hope your optimism is warranted here. I think it is, but I hope you're right as it relates to this election in the courts. Exactly. Fingers crossed. All right, everybody. You've heard from our guests, and I want to hear from you. When we come back from the break, I'm going to the phone lines. And it's a really straightforward question tonight. I want to know who you voted for, and I want to know why. And please do me a favor. If you're on the West Coast, that bottom number is for you. So if you're calling us west of the Mississippi, whether it be from Texas or California, there's your number. The top number, anyone calling us from the Eastern Seaboard, we're trying to create as much space as possible so people from both parts of this country or all of this country can be a part of the program. Andrew and I'll be back. We'll have some early numbers and also your reaction. Stay with us.